In September 1938, a raiding party in Berlin stood ready to storm the Reich Chancellery and seize Adolf Hitler, a plan drawn up inside the army's high command. The man who could set it in motion was the chief of the General Staff, Franz Halder. Then the news came. The British Prime Minister was flying to Munich and there would be no war. Halder called it off, and days later the plotters burned their papers in a fireplace. It was the closest the German generals ever came to stopping Hitler. What they thought of him ran from open loathing to worship, yet for most of them it made remarkably little difference to how they served him. Franz Halder was not the kind of man you would expect to plan a coup. He was a Bavarian artillery officer, devout and precise, a gifted staff technician who had climbed to the top of the general staff on ability alone. To a professional like him, Hitler was not a leader to admire, but a dangerous amateur. A man with no training playing at strategy with an army other people had built. That was one view of Hitler inside the officer corps. It was far from the only one. At one end stood the men who loathed him. Kurt von Hammerstein-Eckert, the commander-in-chief of the army when Hitler took power, was so hostile to the Nazis that he had urged President Hindenburg not to make Hitler chancellor at all. Within a year, he was eased out of his command. Others sneered from a safer distance. Hindenburg himself is said to have called Hitler the Bohemian corporal, a jab at his low rank and foreign birth that the aristocrats in the officer clubs happily repeated. At the other end stood the believers. Field Marshal Werner von Blomberg, the war minister, was so taken with Hitler that his own colleagues mocked him as the rubber lion, stern on the outside and soft in the leader's presence. Wilhelm Keitel, who would come to run the Armed Forces High Command, turned into such a yes-man that officers rebuilt his name into Lacketel, a pun on the German word for lackey. Goering said he had the mind of a sergeant in the body of a field marshal. Between the loathing and the worship sat almost everyone else. Most officers were somewhere in that middle, and their view of Hitler was shaped as much by what he was doing for the army as by what they thought of the man himself. They disliked his manners and his origins, but they wanted what he was delivering. He tore up the Treaty of Versailles, which had capped the army at 100,000 men and stripped it of tanks, aircraft, and a general staff. Money flooded into rearmament. The political left they feared was crushed. For a professional soldier, that transformation was intoxicating. The differences between these men were real. Some despised Hitler, others admired him, and many simply accepted him because of what he was doing for the army. But private opinion was one thing, obedience was another. In the summer of 1934, Hitler found a way to bind the officer corps to him personally. It started with a purge. Hitler owed part of his rise to the Sturmabteilung, or SA, the brown-shirted stormtroopers whose street violence had helped bring him to power. By 1934, the SA had swollen past 2 million men, and its chief, Ernst Röhm, wanted it to swallow the regular army and become a revolutionary force in its own right. To the professional officer corps, barely 100,000 strong, that was a mortal threat. At the end of June, Hitler struck first. Over a few days, Röhm and the SA's leaders were swept away in what the regime called the Night of the Long Knives. The generals welcomed it. The rival that had threatened them was gone. But the same purge reached into their own ranks. 2 retired generals, Kurt von Schleicher, a former chancellor, and Ferdinand von Bredow, died in those days as well. It was a plain warning that the new government would settle scores with soldiers too. The army command said almost nothing, and its silence would cost it more than it knew. Weeks later came the moment that bound the officer corps to Hitler in person. On August 2nd, 1934, President Hindenburg died. That same day, before the old marshal was even buried, every soldier in Germany was made to swear a new oath. The old pledge had bound them to the Constitution. The new one bound them to Adolf Hitler by name, promising unconditional obedience to him as supreme commander. It was Blomberg, the rubber lion, who pushed the oath forward, hoping to tie Hitler closer to the army. He had created a promise the generals themselves would later use to justify their obedience. Then in early 1938, Hitler turned on the 2 men at the very top of the army. Blomberg was forced out over his marriage in January. Within days, the army's commander-in-chief, Werner von Fritsch, was accused on fabricated evidence of a crime that ended his career. Both of Germany's most senior soldiers were gone inside a month, and no one lifted a hand to save them. Not the men who despised Hitler, and not the men who adored him. Hitler abolished the War Ministry, built a new high command under the compliant Keitel, and named himself Supreme Commander in fact as well as in name. Now it mattered less what an officer thought of Hitler. He had bound the army by oath, shown that he could remove its senior commanders, and taken direct control of the armed forces. Whatever many officers felt in private, in public they obeyed. But in 1938, a small group of senior officers came closer than ever to turning that private opposition into action. Ludwig Beck, the chief of the General Staff, resigned that summer rather than help plan a war he believed would ruin Germany. His successor was Franz Halder, who shared that fear and went further, backing a plan to arrest Hitler if he ordered an attack on Czechoslovakia. For a brief moment that autumn, many senior officers believed Hitler was leading Germany toward disaster. Then the victories began, and they changed a great many minds. Poland fell in weeks in 1939. In the spring of 1940, the German army did what it had failed to do in 4 years of the First World War. It beat France, and it did so in 6 weeks. Officers who had called the plan reckless were stunned. The amateur they had sneered at had overruled his own general staff and been proven right. And for a season, even the doubters wondered whether he was some kind of genius. Halder himself, who had schemed to remove Hitler 2 years earlier, spent 1940 filling his diary with one triumphant plan after another. Success did what threats never could. It quieted the skeptics. In the summer of 1941, Hitler turned east, and Halder helped plan the invasion of the Soviet Union. His staff drafted the orders that stripped Soviet officials and prisoners of any protection under the laws of war. The same officer who had once considered removing Hitler was now helping organize his war. Whatever contempt he still carried, it made no difference to what he did. Long after the war, Halder told an American interrogator that in those years he had always carried a loaded pistol when he went in to see Hitler. Whether or not that was true, the record is plain about what his hand actually did. It signed the orders. Then the invasion stalled, and the old professional contempt returned, sharper than before. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of Germany's most respected commanders, judged that Hitler had talent and nerve but no real military training and no sense of what an army could and could not do. He was not alone. Up and down the senior ranks, men who had cheered in 1940 now grumbled that a former corporal was overruling field marshals. Again and again, Hitler overruled commanders who were closer to the fighting and knew the situation on the ground. When the Normandy front broke in 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the German commander in the West, was asked what should be done, and was later remembered as snapping back, "Make peace, you fools." By then, many generals privately believed Hitler was destroying them, but believing it did not change what they did. A small number finally turned to action. On July 20, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg carried a bomb into Hitler's headquarters and left it beside the map table. Ludwig Beck, the general who had resigned in 1938, was to lead the new government. Hitler survived. The plot collapsed within hours, and Beck took his own life that night. The interrogations that followed dragged up old conspiracies, and on July 23rd, the Gestapo arrested Halder himself and sent him to Flossenburg and then Dachau. Most of the generals, though, had never joined. Keitel stayed a lackey to the end, signing whatever was put in front of him. Manstein approached more than once, refused every time. Prussian field marshals do not mutiny, he is remembered as saying. Even Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, Germany's most famous soldier, was only loosely tied to the plot. In October 1944, 2 generals came to his home and offered him a choice: a public trial that would ruin his family, or poison and a hero's funeral. He took the poison. The oath of 1934 had become a ready answer whenever officers were asked why they had not acted. Then the war ended, and the surviving generals began to write, and Franz Halder ended up holding the pen. His hidden diary was found in an attic and carried to Nuremberg, where he testified against the Nazi leaders he had once served. After the trials, the United States Army hired him for a different job. Hungry for intelligence on its new Cold War enemy, it put the former generals to work writing the history of the Eastern Front. From offices in Germany, Halder directed some 700 of them through roughly 2,500 studies, and told the writers to cut whatever damaged the army's good name. The legend they built was of a clean, professional Wehrmacht, betrayed by an amateur dictator and innocent of the worst crimes. In memoirs with titles like Lost Victories, generals who had obeyed Hitler to the last now presented themselves as clear-eyed professionals who had seen through him all along. In 1961, the Americans gave Halder a medal for his help. making him the only man ever decorated by both Adolf Hitler and an American president. He had despised Hitler enough to plot his arrest, served him well enough to help organize a war, and outlived him long enough to help shape the story that followed. That, in the end, was the contradiction at the heart of the German officer corps. There was never one view of Hitler. Men like Manstein despised him, men like Keitel devoted themselves to him, and most stood somewhere in between. But for most of them, personal opinion was never enough to overcome the oath, ambition, the thrill of victory, or their own part in Hitler's wars. After 1945, the survivors made their private contempt the center of the story they told about themselves. By then, they were the ones writing the history. We've seen what Hitler's generals thought of him, but what did they think of Eisenhower, Montgomery, Patton, Zhukov, and other commanders they faced across the battlefield? That's the story in our next video. Thanks for watching. If you found this video insightful, like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more History Inside, and we'll see you in the next one.